welcome back to Scribe Life. In the previous episode or lesson, we covered the first group of Minim letters, which consisted of the I, J, N, M, and R. And in this video, we'll be continuing with the Minim letters, starting with the U and then working on to V, W, C, E, and T. So let's get started, okay? The U follows that same Minim pattern that we discussed in the first video on Minim letters, with the diamond at the top of the X height, pulling down into a vertical, forming a second diagonal. It'll be slightly longer than usual to accommodate the second stroke. Another diamond shape, and then a second vertical that joins at that bottom diagonal, much the same way that you would with an A or an O or a D, except that instead of closing the letter with that diagonal joining at the far right corner of the first vertical, it's capped by that diamond shape. And then, sorry, I digress. Finishing this letter, you form another diagonal stroke, and then if you want, you can add that flourish that we discussed in the previous video by keeping your pen in contact with the paper, twisting the nib so that the far left corner is still touching the paper, and then draw it out and in a curve, dragging that still wet ink into this hairline shape. So I'll do that one more time. Start with a diamond shape, vertical, and then another slightly elongated diagonal, second diamond shape, vertical meeting up with that bottom diagonal, and then a second diagonal, and then the optional flourish. So that's the U. Now the V can be formed using the same structure as the U without using the diagonal, if you like, the simplified version. So you have the diamond, vertical, diagonal, diamond, and then vertical joining up with the bottom diagonal. Or if you want to do a slightly more complex but rather pretty version, if you will, what you do is you start from the very top of the ascender line and then pull in a 45-degree angle until you reach the top of the X height, and then pull down vertically, starting at the bottom of that vertical, pull into a diagonal, start at the top again about a nib width away and pull a diamond, and then a second vertical that joins up with that first diagonal. And that is entirely optional, but it can add a real sort of focal point and sort of a bit more variety in your letter form if you're looking for something a little bit more flamboyant, if you will. And that is actually historically accurate to my knowledge. I'm pretty sure I've seen it in manuscripts here and there if they want to add a bit of flourish. It's just a little bit trickier than the standard shape. And I'll show you how to do it one more time just so you can get a feel for it. Starting at the top of the ascender, pull. You can add some real curve there if you really want until you reach the top of the X height. Pull vertically again until you're one nib width from the bottom. Pull into a diagonal shape until it's, and then start the second diagonal so that it's one nib width away from the first vertical, and then pull down the final vertical that meets at that bottom diagonal. And that's the sort of flourished V. The next letter is the W, which is a very uniform shape. It's sort of like an upside down M. So you start with the diamond, vertical, diagonal, diamond, vertical, diagonal. Apologies, I'm getting a bit distracted. I've got a puppy behind me that's snoring. And then you finish with that final diamond, and then the vertical that meets with that second bottom diagonal. And that one's should show you again. Again, I've not quite followed that rule, but ideally there should be about a nib width between each vertical. I'll show you one more time. I'll just keep quiet so that I can concentrate. Diagonal, vertical, diagonal, diagonal, diamond shape, vertical, diagonal, diamond, vertical, meeting with the diagonal. And see, you can see there much more that there's that familiar picket fence shape. Ideally that shouldn't necessarily touch at the top, but when you've got a very wet nib, that does tend to sometimes happen. The next layer that we're going to do is the C, which is very simple. It's just a vertical, diagonal, pulling out, and then you can do a slight flourish, and then starting at the top there so that the left corner of the nib touches the first vertical and then meets with the top of the X height, pull diagonally and curve upwards slightly. So do that one more time. Vertical, diagonal, flourish, diagonal that curves ever so slightly. And then the E is formed in a similar manner, starting one nib width from the bottom, pull vertical, start at the bottom there, pull diagonal, and then you can add the optional flourish. Starting at the top of that vertical, curve, and then pull back towards that first vertical so that it forms that closed letter for that part of the top part of the E. So one more time, that's the vertical, diagonal with optional flourish, slightly curved diagonal, and then pull to meet with the vertical again from the diagonal. And then the final letter in this grouping is the T, which is, I guess, sort of similar to the R that was in the previous letter, except instead of a diagonal stroke, it's a horizontal stroke at the top, and I'll show you what I mean in a moment. You start at the top of the X height, pull down until you're one nib width from the bottom of the X height, pull into a diagonal, optional flourish of course, and then starting so that the top right corner of the nib is touching the back right section of the vertical, and then just pull horizontally, and then optionally you can lift the nib and tilt it and then form the hairline. So I'll do that one more time. Vertical, diagonal, and then horizontal, twist the nib and then pull a slight curve and then straighten out to form the hairline, and that's just for extra flourish, and it's an optional choice for you. So that's the second group of the Minim letters. Again, familiarize yourself with that very sort of uniform picket fence sort of pattern, and in the next video we'll have a look at the ascender letters, and until then, keep scribbling.